In 1974, a man walked into a forest in northern Thailand. He was 31 years old. He had a university degree, a promising career, and a family who begged him not to go. He went anyway. He would not speak again for 40 years. Not a word, not a single syllable to another human being. When he finally broke his silence, on the last morning of his life, the monks who had lived beside him for decades leaned in close. What he said took 11 seconds. This is the story of Luang Por Kasem, and those 11 seconds changed everyone who heard them. His full name was Fra Ajahn Kasem Khemako. He was born in 1919 in Udon Thani, a quiet province in northeastern Thailand, where the rice fields stretched so flat you could see a storm coming from 30 miles away. He was not, by nature, a quiet man. Friends remembered him as sharp, funny, someone who filled a room. He became a monk at 22, which in Thailand was common, almost expected. Young men would ordain for a season, receive some merit, then return to ordinary life. Kasem did not return. Something happened inside the temple that he could not undo. He once told a fellow monk, this was before the silence, "I saw a dead body by the road, and I realized I had no idea what I was doing with my life." He studied under Ajahn Mun, the most revered forest monk of the 20th century, a man who slept 2 hours a night and considered comfort to be the enemy of awakening. Under Ajahn Mun, Kasem learned that the mind, untrained, is not a home. It is a fire. He spent 12 years learning to sit with that fire. Then, in 1974, he decided the only way forward was to go further inside. He took a vow. No speech, no conversation, no teaching out loud, no reply, not to students, not to abbots, not to kings. 40 years of interior work. He moved to Wat Tam Klong Fen, a forest monastery carved into the limestone hills of Nong Bua Lampu. He was 55 years old. The silence began. Now, here is what most people get wrong about this kind of silence. They imagine it as emptiness, a blank life, a grey life, a life with nothing in it. It was the opposite. The monks who lived near Kasem during those 40 years describe a man of overwhelming presence, not despite the silence. Because of it, one monk, a Canadian named Bhikkhu Analayo, who stayed at the monastery in the 1990s, wrote in his journal, "I have never felt more seen by someone who said nothing." The silence was not absence, it was density. Let's be precise about what his days contained. He woke at 3 in the morning, every morning, for 40 years. He would walk meditation for 2 hours before dawn, barefoot on a worn stone path he knew by feel, in total darkness, sometimes in monsoon rain. He ate 1 meal a day, before noon, whatever was placed in his bowl. He did not choose his food. He did not refuse his food. He slept on a wooden platform, no mattress. He communicated, when absolutely necessary, through gesture and written notes on small slips of paper. He had a system, a nod for yes, a specific tilt of the head for I understand, a raised hand, palm outward, slow and steady, that the monks eventually recognized as meaning, "Leave this with me." Visitors would come from across Southeast Asia, politicians, businessmen, mothers carrying sick children. They would sit across from him. He would listen. Then he would write something on a slip of paper, fold it in half, and hand it over without looking up. Those slips of paper became known in the region as Bai Kam, leaf words. Some people framed them. A few are still displayed in temples across Thailand today. One reads, "The thing that is hurting you is not the situation. It is your belief that the situation should be different." 7 words, written in 1987, on a torn corner of brown paper, by a monk who had not spoken in 13 years. In the spring of 2015, Kasem was 95 years old. He had been unwell for several months, not dramatically, not painfully, just retreating, as if he were slowly turning down the volume on the visible world. The senior monks gathered, not out of panic, out of respect. They knew what was happening. In Thai forest monasteries, the dying of a great teacher is not a crisis. It is a ceremony. Monks took shifts sitting beside him, day and night, in silence, which felt, given the circumstances, like the correct language. On the morning of January 30th, 2015, something shifted. His breathing changed. The monk sitting with him, a young Burmese man who had been at the monastery for only 8 months, later said he couldn't explain it. It was as if the room changed temperature. Not colder, stiller. He reached for the small bell beside the mat and rang it twice. Other monks came. 12 of them gathered in a half-circle, and then, for the first time in 40 years, Luang Por Kasem opened his mouth to speak. They almost didn't hear it. His voice, unused for 4 decades, was barely a sound. One of the monks present said it was like wind moving through dry leaves. You could tell it had been a voice once. He had to repeat himself. The monks leaned forward. Some of them were crying before he even finished. What did he say? In Pali, in the language the Buddha himself spoke. He said, "Sabbe sankhara anicca." All things that are formed are impermanent. That was it. 7 syllables, 11 seconds of sound after 40 years of none. But here is what you need to understand. This was not a random quote. Sabbe sankhara anicca were the Buddha's own reported last words, spoken under the sal trees in Kushinagar in 483 BC to a gathered crowd of thousands. Kasem had spent 40 years sitting inside this teaching, not studying it, not reciting it, living it, and in the last breath of his own life, he offered it back, to the monks, to the room, to whoever was listening, as if to say, "I went in to find out if this was true. I found out. It is." The young Burmese monk who rang the bell later said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. He said, "In that moment, I understood that he hadn't been silent for 40 years. He had been preparing to say that one sentence. Everything before was just getting ready. Now. Why does this matter? You are not going to take a vow of silence. You are not going to give up your job and walk into a forest. You don't need to. But something in this story is for you. Otherwise, you wouldn't still be here. Here is what I think it is. Most of us live at the surface of ourselves. Not because we're shallow, but because the noise never stops long enough to let us go any deeper. We fill every available silence with phones, with podcasts, with the low hum of anxiety that we've come to mistake for productivity. Kasem's life is an extreme example, but the principle underneath it is not extreme at all. It is simply this: the quieter you become, the more you can hear, not more voices, more truth. The Buddhist concept at the center of his practice is called sati, often translated as mindfulness, but that word has been flattened by wellness culture into something small and soft. Sati in its original form means to remember what matters, not to relax, not to de-stress, to remember, to come back over and over to what is actually true underneath all the noise. Kasem spent 40 years remembering. Most of us struggle to remember for 40 minutes. That gap is not a failure. It's an invitation. The forest is not in northern Thailand. It's in the space between one thought and the next. You've been there. You know what it feels like. That moment when the mind goes quiet and something underneath it, warm, steady, impossible to name, becomes briefly visible. Kasem dedicated his life to that moment. He called it home. On the morning of January 30th, 2015, as the light came through the trees at Wat Tam Klong Fen, a man who had not spoken in 40 years gave the monks around him a final gift. He gave them the same words the Buddha gave his monks 2,500 years before. All things that are formed are impermanent. Then he was quiet again. And at 7:14 in the morning, 3 minutes after he finished speaking, Luang Por Kasem Khemako closed his eyes. The monks sat with him in silence for the rest of the day. No one left, no one spoke, because, after 40 years of watching him, they had finally understood something. Silence is not what happens when you have nothing to say. Silence is what happens when you have said everything that matters. And somewhere, in a glass case at Wat Tam Klong Fen, there is a small slip of brown paper. Written on it, in faded ink, in a hand that hasn't moved in years. The thing that is hurting you is not the situation. It is your belief that the situation should be different. It was written in 1987. It was true then. It is true now.